Hello, I'm Penelope Maver, and welcome back to the Earth Converse podcast, where we explore our relationship and conversations with the Earth, all in the hope of inspiring a deeper connection with ourselves, each other, and the Earth that is our home. And today I have Emma Taylor here, and we don't even know how we actually met. And this is the first
No.
face conversation. And she's been following the podcast, and I really was wanting to say, I'd love to hear your story. And she goes, and at a certain point, she said, I'm ready. I've got an offering. I'm ready. And it's a beautiful offering of earth journaling, intuitive expression. And Emma actually captures what a beautiful poem of Mary Oliver, it's sometime, and she goes, instructions for living a life. Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. And Emma's going to tell her story, and we're probably going to go linear, but there's a flexing to go. So welcome, Emma. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Penelope. And thank you again for inviting me. And isn't life just wonderful? Because we have no real idea of how we met one another, but we knew that we were destined to speak at a point in time. And that point has arrived now. And you had the graciousness to reach out the invitation. And this time I said yes. And I'm very glad that I did. So thank you.
I've got a little bit of goosebumps just about the synchronicity. There's just all magic, isn't it? And so I'll start off, how would you describe your relationship with nature? And then we'll go in from the evolution from...
Oh, yeah, so you could have warned me. You've got to start off a big question. Okay. So I was very fortunate. So I was brought up in West Wales. I live in the United Kingdom. And West Wales, for those of you who don't know it, is quite a sort of a remote and wild place in the United Kingdom. And it's just really beautiful. Rugged coastlines, ancient woodlands, bit of Celtic mythology sort of thrown in there as well. And as an only child, I had many, many hours just being able to spend time wandering out in nature, with a fat pony for company and the farmer's dog, because this is the days, Penelope, when we could, parents could actually just let their children out and not have to worry about them. And I'd go out with some sandwiches and a drink, and I'd go out at 9 o'clock in the morning, and then I'd sort of, stumble home about 6 o'clock in the evening, and had all these adventures and done all these wonderful things, and probably be very messy, might have some, cuts and bruises on me from climbing over the rocks and what have you. So my relationship with nature, I think, fused from that very early age when I was a child. And I still to this day have a really strong connection to a particular place in West Wales where I always need to go back to at least once a year. It's sort of like an annual pilgrimage. And I have a real sense of connection to the land and the place. It's actually an estuary. So, you can really get a sense of the rhythms of nature with the tides coming in and going out. And it's the timelessness that's there, because I was saying to you, I'm nearly 50 years old, and although the landscape has changed and shifted, it still fundamentally remains true to its essence of what it is. And so it's a combination of that memory that's evoked when you go back, but also much deeper than that. There's a real soulful connection to that whole environment, and it feels very protective. And it feels very renewing to be able to be there and stand in that space. So
longing.
Yeah, and I had a few years where I was fortunate as well to live in an urban environment and live in a city, which was fine. But I knew in my heart of heart that I needed to get back and be closer to nature. And I eventually was able to do that, but not in West Wales, but I ended up in Shropshire, which isn't quite as wild as West Wales, but it's equally as nourishing for me, particularly because there's quite a lot of water where I live. And it was quite strange because I didn't really realize, but the house that I have, it's fed by a well. So we have our own sort of well water supply source, and it's called Elm Cottage. And a couple of summers ago, we found 2 elm trees that had survived. So they're like my precious children. So it's all,
Oh,
everything is sort of has this wonderful sort of synchronicity to it in ways which I'll never really understand, but I can be like Mary Oliver and be in awe of it, really.
yes. And it sounds like this lovely water theme or something, from the estuary to the well, and I'm probably alert to it because I've just recently heard
Mm.
that it's not planet Earth, it's planet water. Isn't that beautiful?
Wow, I haven't heard that.
Isn't it because it is?
Yeah, because we actually, yeah, we're but
Yeah,
the surface, we are literally coated with so much. Yeah,
isn't that lovely?
that is gorgeous.
Hmm.
And and as human beings, we are 70% water.
Exactly.
And
And
we are conceived, we are carried in the umbilic fluid, which is, I don't know if it's water. Someone will say no, it's not water, but it is of a fluid nature. So there's a fluidity to us,
yeah,
which is a mirror in terms of the fluidity that exists within nature,
mm,
in terms of the way that it changes and the impermanence, the cycles and the rhythms.
that holds memory, and also just in learning to be in it, to be surrendered to it, or
Yeah.
feel held by it. And there's a lovely experience in that.
Yeah.
Get there because between, I suppose that fundamental
Hmm.
childhood wilds of Wales, which I can imagine the real appreciation of opening space, but then
Mm.
you went into, well, human development.
Well, I did. Well, it's all to do with love.
Good love.
I thought you'd resonate with that one, Penelope. It's all to do with love.
Yeah.
So when I was in my early 20s, I met a lovely man from the West Midlands. And, it was one of at that moment in life where sometimes you had to make a choice. Who's going to move? Who's going to make that move? And it was me. So I moved up to the West Midlands. And when I moved to the West Midlands, I continued to develop my career in initially learning and development. And I then expanded that into a field of practice, which is called organizational development, which means that you're looking at the interactions of people and teams within an organization, and if they're working together effectively, and then how can you improve that effectiveness, in a sort of nutshell. But it was so curious to how I got there, because I actually got there. I actually ended up working somewhere where I thought I would never in a million years be attracted to, or would have any connection to who I am as a person, and what I feel is important. So I actually ended up, when I moved to the West Midlands, I actually ended up taking a HR role with a Japanese manufacturing company in an industrial estate in Telford. Which, for those of you in our UK, it's not the most glamorous.
Love that, really, from the wilds of Wales, industrial.
Suddenly, I'm in the heart of, the industrial heartlands. And I was very fortunate because I met someone who was quite inspirational in terms of what he wanted to achieve, what they were trying to achieve within this particular manufacturing environment. And there was something about the manufacturing environment which completely, from a people perspective, it completely fascinated me, in terms of, and again, it's almost to do with this rhythm, this flow of the work, and how everybody had an understanding of how they contributed to the particular products that they were making. Now, there were a whole host of issues, and uh, challenges and difficulties that also sort of underlaid that. But there was also something which I managed to key into, and I think it must be the romantic in me, all this is to do with love, but I have got a bit of a romantic side as well. And this organization was operating in the UK, but it was Japanese owned, and it had a very strong Japanese cultural influence. And I don't know how, but somehow I was able to pick up on those Japanese notes with regards to their perspective and approach sort of to people management and human relations, or they didn't call it human resources, they called it human relations, which is a subtle thing, but I think it's it just gives you a little hint of the way that they were looking at things. And there were two key things in my story which contributed, I think, to my own development. And the first one is, from the Japanese perspective, that even from a manufacturing point of view, they looked at the artfulness in that process, because they had a really deep understanding that it was the human hands that were actually making these items, and how they could engage the lowest paid people to really get a sense of their contribution through using their hands. So that craftsmanship, and having that sense of pride, and having that sense of contribution in there. So there was this craftsmanship that was going on. There was also this wonderful other thing called Kaizen, which was all about incremental improvement, but which, from an industrial point of view, you can take away a meaning in relation to sort of, we always need to improve our product, but there was another underlying bit in that, again, in a sense that there was this assumption that everyone is creative and everyone can contribute to make things better. The secret is, how do you enable those individuals to have a voice? And you can then access all that potential that you have, and that's there on your shop floor, and it's in your workforces, more in their hands, more than an intellectual, rational sort of response. Because a lot of the products that they made it was very manual, and it was the touch. They could feel that something had changed, and then they'd be able to say, well, actually, I think there's something wrong with this little bit of plastic strip or something like that. You go, wow, how do you manage to do that? So it was an environment that really captured my imagination and sparked that sort of, you mentioned it before. It was, there was something there. It was about the observation. It was about the focus on making things, and also that deeper connection to sort of a creative energy, which, we have as human beings, but also is mirrored back to us in nature itself.
There's so much there that you said, Emma, and I'm thinking about where you had because there's a stereotype of manufacturing, but you're seeing the beauty, isn't it?
Well, I'm laughing because I'm just thinking back now to the engineers. They must have thought I was just crazy, But it's wonderful, because the Japanese, they would listen to me. I don't know if they understood me, but they would listen to me, and they would sort of get a sense. They get a sense that I was seeing something that was not on the surface. And that was what was the real gift that I think that the Japanese experience gave me, is that, they would always invite you to look deeper, to see what is happening beyond the obvious. Because from the Japanese perspective, from the manufacturing perspective, that's where you would be able to make the connections with regards to maybe where things weren't working in the way that they needed. It was a deeper pattern that was the invitation. Look for the deeper pattern, and then use that deep, and then that is your point of entry in order to be able then to engage into a dialogue or have a conversation around what potentially could be different.
And I love it from my experience of working with, you know, Japanese manufacturers. It is this that depth, and seeing, like, and it's the little, you know, it's a beautiful, and their beauty, their crafts and their art, you know, in terms of that. And there's a real sense in that, sense of it, you know, just... It's
really cultural. I mean, have you been to Japan? Did you go when you... Yeah, you know, and it sort of just blows it. You know, the first time I went, I mean, I was just like, I was overawed just because of the, you know, the cultural difference. But it's the care and it's the attention, and it's like every day is infused with a instinctive attraction to beauty, even if they, you know, even if it's not sort of voiced in that way, but there is something about how to bring that beauty into their everyday life in some way. And that could be through very simplistic rituals, you know, literally the bowing, isn't it? Just that active respect, that acknowledging that I see you, you are a unique person, and I see you just through that gesture. Such a beautiful thing.
Such a beautiful thing. And then it's such a paradox, because then you see that, you know,
well, yeah, we won't go there.
Crazy mess. It's like, oh god. But I love, and then this sort of,
you could see where my bias is. I don't know. Oh
yeah. But I love and also, but in terms of even, you know, manufacturing, which you know, in many respects manufacturing doesn't bring out the fullness in somebody, you know, it is just the hands or the head, but actually, you know, where people's motivation, you know, can you do that piece, can you concentrate on that plastic? And so therefore seeing the line of sight of what is ultimately in, you know, the end product. And and that everybody plays a part in that.
Yeah, but you're right, and it's good to voice it. There is a huge shadow side to the whole of that. I mean, when I worked there, there was I was like solo white female, you know, and even from a diversity point of view, when you go to Japan and you go to the Japanese corporations, all the executive levels, all the senior levels, you know, it's all Japanese executives of a particular age, and that again is part of their structure and the narrative that they have within terms of what their expectations are of that work life commitment. And I think, you know, I probably about 5-6 years ago that I worked in the Japanese organization, but I think there's a slow shift, but I think it will be slow because, you know, it's a blind spot.
And so, so you went out of, so 5 or 6 years ago, what happened?
Well, I actually, I was doing a lot of traveling as part of the role that I had. So I started off in the manufacturing plant in Telford. And then from there, I moved into essentially a European headquarters. So I lost my Dr. Martin boots and my overalls, which I was very sad about. Actually, I enjoyed that. And I had to look, you know, all professional. But I was able to connect with our manufacturing operations throughout Europe, and work with them on various projects that were coming over from Japan, essentially, because it was the organizational structure was still very much Japan is the center. Then we have our overseas group companies, and the overseas group companies will please follow our instructions or our direction. Yes, there can be a little bit of deviation, but we like to have a degree of standardization so that we know everybody is working in the same way. So that meant that I did a lot of traveling, and I then realized that I needed to come, it was time to come back to the UK and settle here. And I did, and I went into another automotive environment, which was very different. It was Jaguar Land Rover in the West Midlands, and I was there for probably about 18 months. And it was another amazing experience, but for a completely different reason, because they were, they had a completely different model of operating, and were a completely different place with regards to what they wanted to achieve as an organization. So it was a time when I had to dig pretty deep in order to understand, what am I there for, and how can I contribute in some way, and I did the best that I could do whilst I was there, but then the end of the story, I found that it was really strange. I just couldn't work for a British company. The cultural difference was just too much for me. I think I'd probably been, I'd been programmed in Japan. They probably put the chip in.
It might even, like, in terms of rubbing up, when we have a strong reaction to something, like,
yeah.
What's it telling us? Are we, yeah.
So, it was, and I thought, well, that's fine. But also there was something as well, this deeper, I called it was a niggle at first, and it was like, then it became a question in terms of, could I be asking questions around how are we going to choose to live, and where does the automotive industry sit within that, and how committed are they to really making significant changes in order to support what we need to do from a climate perspective, and the huge cultural, political, social shifts that need to happen, and how do we support leaders in those organizations to start to be able to engage with these issues and be able to hold, you mentioned it within the Japanese, the paradoxical aspect to them, but this is even more amplified because the complexity in it is just massive. And really, you are looking at an industry that hasn't really changed for 100 years, particularly in relation to the manufacturing process. You've got the assembly line, it's just in time. The whole aim of the game is to sell as many units as possible, and to get people to renew their cars, every 2-3 years, because then we need to get new models out with even more fancy things on, which is the way that it's been for a very long time. But at some point, someone in the industry needs to step up and say, we need to have a different conversation now. We really need to think about how we can support our consumers in order to make different choices, and to really start to be thinking about what do we need in the future, and what might that model look like, and then how can we maybe start to engage with that in a way which means that as a business we continue to be successful, but we evolve, because we just can't keep doing what we've been doing for the last 20 or 30 years.
Are those conversations happening?
Well, it was really curious. So when I worked with a Japanese organization, they had a much, as you mentioned, they had this really long-term view. So we were sort of working on a 50-year plan. And within that, they were very much focused on the hybrid and the alternative technologies. But it was actually the alternative technologies. It was the conversation at that time wasn't so much around how are we going to get people to use cars less, i.e. in terms of car share, or maybe not even owning a car. maybe renting a car when you need one, or having it as a car share. What other types of infrastructure could we start to investigate and prototype and offer our customer base? So it was very much focused on the actual technology itself. So it was moving away from the combustion engine into these other forms of energy. But the question within that energy is that energy's got to come from somewhere, hasn't it? So there's always going to be a resource that you're going to need to access in some way, and that potentially, could have consequences. So that was the type of conversation that they were having. They were slowly starting to move, but it wasn't really within their remit. My experience within JLR was a very interesting one, because they really were at the cusp, because their whole strategy had been on the diesel engine, and that is actually what made them who they are. And it was very much embedded into their identity. So to be able to start to shift and have different conversations within that, you're really asking people to have a conversation at an identity level. And most people in business, they're not going to be thinking about that. They're thinking, what are you going on about? So they were very at the early stages of starting to be thinking about how they can electrify their existing portfolio of vehicles, and also how maybe they can start to offer different ways that people can get access to their vehicles, so that you didn't have to maybe buy a vehicle. You could maybe rent a vehicle. But that was very, very much in its embryonic way. And they really seem to be more excited about automation, which has gone very quiet, I notice, at the moment.
Yes, it has, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. But it was it was a difficult time for everybody, because it was you've got what you're tapping into within any big global industry is, you're tapping into that capitalist model. They're there to make money.
It's such a
so any sort of how do they start to evolve without it impacting on their performance to the shareholders? Where's that space? And it's a little bit, it's about making that space within the organization, so that you can have very clever people who can start to innovate, and also be given license to start to have these really crazy, wacky ideas, which might be out here somewhere that people think, oh no, that's not going to happen. But within them, they could actually have the seeds of something which will start to manifest itself later down the line.
And it's the old analogy, isn't it? Sort of, how do you change the engine while it's you fly it, like change.
Yeah, but it's going to come down to personal choice. We're currently a 2-car family, but we're going to go down to a one. We've realized that we can work out being just a 1 car. So, we're not in a position where I can have just a bicycle, but we can have a smaller car, and we can also think about what type of energy it uses within the infrastructure that's available to us. So again, it's about educating the consumer, and then it's about supporting people who want to make different choices, but also not ostracizing people who have to make other choices as well. Absolutely. Because this technology is very expensive still at the moment, so it precludes a lot of people to even be able to come in and sort of participate in even thinking about, well, I'm going to buy an electric car and I'm going to buy a hybrid car, because it's just not available to them at this moment.
Yeah, it's so complex. I did some work for Nissan actually, and made a choice about electrifying. They wouldn't go to hybrid, but I remember I got as a they said, "Oh, we're at the dinner table. What car have you got?" And at the time, I said, "I haven't got a car."
Yeah.
Embarrassed, actually. I was sort of like, and you are the future. And because it is about that community, I think that there will be, that the industry itself will shuffle around. There'll be losers and winners, I think.
Yeah.
Eventually, but it is both at a systemic level and also individual choice, isn't it? And I like how you said, going back to the human resources and human relations, because I just podcast recently. I'm just sort of absorbing it all about actually, yeah, you call them resources, we call them relations, you know, or relatives, which
Yes.
I think is an interesting thing. And I'm there's a article or something stirring me about
Mm.
the word fossil fuels, which we're
Mm.
literally using the fossils of our ancestors. No wonder
Mm.
they're pissed off. No
Mhm.
wonder that it's creating, you know, get greenhouse gases.
That's a great connection, though, and it's language as well, isn't it? It's how we,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, actually, you know what
how
it
we
is.
frame these very, you know, they're complex conversations that but it's necessary to have mass engagement in them,
Yeah.
so people can be informed, and then they can start to make informed choices around what is possible for me at this moment, and in terms of, well, and then how might I contribute to doing my small part. And I suppose that maybe that comes from, that Japanese experience as well. You mentioning, it's about, rather than one person walking 1,000 miles, you've got 1,000 people who take one step forward. So it's the income, it's both, it always is both, isn't it? It's never either or, that or this. It's actually, it's this combination that comes together to really sort of support and mobilize the big shifts and the changes that we have. So it has to happen at a political level, in terms of the government and legislation, then within the industry, them starting to have the different conversations and being courageous enough to start moving in a different direction, even if that means that they're going to be the first one out there, and it might not work out for them, but knowing that will actually start those ripples of change happening, so the pattern will start to be disrupted, and then new patterns can actually start to be formulated from that.
Yeah, and we're seeing that. I think in terms of there is because it takes courage to step in those conversations. I mean, you're a courageous, you held your own in those organizational development. You had a place at the table, and still it's hard, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we do that with leadership. I mean, the systemic things that people will not act, even really, because of the system. It's very hard to be.
Yeah.
And there's also something I do believe that we don't have a conversation in organizations about death and dying. What needs to die in our habits? What needs to die? We talk about maybe legacy or, but we don't actually talk about, the death that's required.
Yeah.
Something has to die in order for something to be reborn.
Well, and it's the hardest thing, isn't it? Because within any creative process or life cycle, then in order to make way for the new, then you're right, something does need to die, but there's a way that you can hold that, and you can honor that, and you can actually make that part of the organizational legacy, so that the next generations that come through can then sort of start to understand, well, what did we have to let go of in order to be able to move into the space where we are now.
Yeah. And so what did you have to let go of in order to reborn on an individual level?
Well, I've had to, I suppose, a lot of it was quite uncomfortable, because I had to let go of my idea of status. So when I worked within an organizational setting, I had a very clear idea around my role, my identity, and the story that I told myself of why I was there and what I was doing in order to make a difference. And then a couple of years ago, I started to consider that might all just be a veneer for me.
What was the starting of the considering? Was there something that sort of, or was it?
It was, and it was, I'm trying to think where it originated from, but I think it was, and so I am quite an intellectual person, so I do read a lot. And I started reading Marianne Woodman. Now, Marianne Woodman is a Jungian psychologist. She's quite sort of well known in the, I don't think she's alive anymore. She died quite a few years ago, but she's well known in those circles from using and drawing upon her own experience of being of a woman, see, but getting into this notion that there is something, there is a feminine psyche, and that's beyond, it's beyond gender. So it's not male, female, is actually, she calls it the feminine principle. And she wrote about this quite extensively, and she wrote about it from a first person perspective initially. And I read this book, and it was called Leaving My Father's House. And I thought, when I first read it, I took it literally, you know, so it was the relationship that she was having with her father, and it was like, oh, it's quite tension and all that sort of, all those dynamics that sort of go on there from a psychological point of view. And then I sat with it for, you know, quite a long time, and I read some of her other books, and then I suddenly realized, I thought, gosh, no, she's talking about something, this deeper pattern that she's talking about here, and it's whoa. And it really knocked me for six, because in terms of my blind spot, that's what my blind spot was. I had no awareness of how much I had repressed my own feminine psyche. I had been a dutiful daughter to the patriarchy in many ways, and I had just emulated patriarchal values in terms of male values of competition, of success, of productivity, of status. I had just sucked all that in, and I didn't, and it was only when, you know, I started to think about this, and I really started to think about what would that next stage of my life be like, that it opened up a whole door into a complete way of knowing the world that I hadn't had access to since I was a little girl in the West Wales, on the beach there and in the woodlands. That was that connection for me. That was me coming home to myself. And that's where nature really played a role in that, because it was only in nature, and it's actually in nature, that I began to have a sense of awareness of what the feminine may be like within me. What was my experience of the feminine within me? Not what was, you know, because my belief is that everyone's going to be having this different experience. So the first step forward is just to become much more congruent with what your own experience is, and start to make sense of that, and notice what comes up for you. Because for me, you know, all this other stuff then started to percolate and bubble up. You know, how hard you've been on myself, how much, you know, try harder, be a perfectionist, go above and beyond, all that sort of stuff. And it took me a while. I had to just, you know, throw that away. Not that I didn't need it, just throw it away.
Have you brought it back as well? Like,
oh well, yes, I don't need it. Oh, I need a bit of it. Oh no, I don't need it. I need a bit of it.
The dance with that. Wow. So it was a sort of an intellectual exercise in terms of reading it. Or
yeah.
The book found you in a way.
As always, yeah.
But then there's sort of like then recognizing to really understand that and really work with that to get you intuitively.
It was, and I was very fortunate, because I think the catalyst for me is I did a MSc at Metanoia in London, which is a Gestaltist orientation. Gestalt is a wonderful psychoanalytic methodology. I'm sure a Gestaltist would think, well, you can explain it much more poetically than that, but that's where I'll take it. And I went there because I was getting frustrated with my practice in organizations, because I wasn't getting the results that I wanted to get with people. In terms of, I wanted them to see that, when you're talking about the automotive industry, I wanted them to see what was possible, to be bolder and to make braver choices and to make bigger changes. And I really struggled to understand what was I doing that wasn't having that impact. And I know what could I do to really get them to sort of see the potential and then to choose to step into that potential. So I ended up at Metanoia doing a MSc in transformational change. And it was very intellectual, because it was a Gestalt, systemic and complexity perspective. So we sort of went up through the layers.
Right.
But when it came to writing my dissertation, the most strangest thing happened, in that I chose to write about, so all this intellectualizing that I'd been doing, out of nowhere came this question: what is embodied knowing? And I spent a year literally intellectualizing around what is embodied knowing. But that was the catalyst that opened me up to the notion that we are so much more than we think that we are, or that we know that we are.
Emma, can I just ask,
Yeah.
can I just do a pause? Literally, like sometimes I do a forest pause, but question, and we'll sit for like 20 seconds just to help the listener to what is embodied knowing for you? Such a great question. Such a great question. So continue this exploration. Yeah.
So thank you for that pause. It's lovely. I don't know, you probably can't hear it, but it's raining quite heavily here. And there's this beautiful drumbeat of rain. If you could hear it, just lovely. Very, really soothing and rhythmic.
Did you feel Marinette soaked in that sort of?
I do. It's the water again, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's here.
But it was just such a feminine, it is the cooling.
Yeah.
The feminine power there.
So I was very fortunate. I had a very good what's that word? What do they use? Like a tutor, dissertation supervisor. And she noticed that I was struggling to find my voice within the scientific method of inquiry, which is very structured, and the emphasis is on going out and finding other people's perspectives and then weaving those together into a coherent narrative or argument. And I was sort of getting tied up in knots trying to do this. So she sort of gently pushed me in the direction of a first person inquiry methodology called heuristics, which is by a Greek gentleman called Mustakas, I think. If I pronounced his name incorrectly, I will apologize to people who are listening. But he is a wonderful, he provided a wonderful alternative perspective on how we could inquire into a direct source of knowing, inviting more of our sensory experience to guide us, and then also inviting the mind and the rational analytic side of the way that we make meaning to come into the conversation and give it another access point for, I suppose, is one way of saying it. So I was very fortunate that I was, that I had Josie as my guide, and I had this question, and that really then was the beginning for me to start to really understand how I could start to integrate different ways of knowing into my experience. And nature or nature connected practice was one of the ways that I began to explore this for myself, really, and give license to my imagination again, because my imagination, I'm a very imaginative child, romantic, imaginative, but all that had been compressed and squashed and sort of
manufacturing process.
yeah put to one side, and hadn't really come into its full energy in that organizational context, because it was deemed to be not appropriate, or sometimes again, people wouldn't really be sure, well, what do we do with this now? What's its usefulness? And also there's some, it's a different way of looking at things, because rather than actually looking for a specific outcome, so a lot of organizational conversation is around decision making, problem solving, very reductive, but other ways of knowing are much more sort of open ended. You're not really looking for an answer, and often you might just be looking for the question and it really annoys people sometimes. so but it's realizing that it's about the context. So what is it, what context are you in, and then what can you bring into that context, which is then just going to be able to support the individuals or the team that are there with that conversation that they are trying to have. And part of that, but part of that, you have to understand your own internal process before you can start bringing that out to other people.
I like this in terms of context. I mean, there's decision makings and problems, but
Yep.
quite often we use, we close things down as opposed to open things up. It's the lovely bouquet, isn't it? Sit with the questions, and more ambiguous place.
Yeah. And it's understandable, because it's very much time driven, time constraints, deadlines, things have to be done by particular times, and but it's really the fascination for me is, how do we make more space for these different ways of experiencing the world, and just to open up pathways in order to bring that into the conversation. It might be that information which is drawn from that perspective isn't utilized, however it's had a presence, and through that presence something will be different because it wasn't there before. So for some people they think, oh, well, that's that sounds really, that's a little bit weird, what are you sort of talking about there? But it is just sort of having a trust that through the process of invitation, you're actually starting to infuse a change in perspective at some level. And often that level might not necessarily be a conscious level.
And that's the sort of the dropping down, isn't it, in terms of the
and it's the invitation just to, for a couple of years I got myself into a little bit of an entanglement, because I thought, I needed to push my mind out of the conversation, and it was all about dropping in and just purely being in this embodied state. And I've actually got to a place now where for me an embodied state is having a holistic perspective. It's being able to in some practices they invite you to look in the 4 directions. So it's very similar to that in many ways. You're actually able to have much more awareness of where am I placing my attention, and then what aspects of my psychic makeup am I asking to make a response to what I am seeing or experiencing or sort of feeling. So you become that beautiful book, isn't it, by David Abraham, Becoming Animal. You literally are becoming more animal again. You're allowing those instinctual aspects of your nature to come and join you and share how they are experiencing that context, the environment that you're in. And the more that you can bring that in, I think the richer and the more juicier the information that you gather presents itself.
Yeah. And it's the whole person, isn't it? Bringing our full selves.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
our complexities and paradoxes and parts of ourselves,
Yeah.
Extroversion. We hold them all, isn't it? We're just all those parts in that whole. And also this metacognition, we can feel into it, but also that discernment and So where did your embodied knowing? So there's
well, I didn't know what to do with it. I mean, I didn't know what to do to start with. It was like, oh. And then I had this really, I had a notion for a while that I was going to become an eco psychologist. I thought that's it, that's the path. But something just didn't quite feel right. And I think it was partly because I think if we go back to my inquiry with the sort of Marion Woodman, and there's much within the psychological field which is incredibly beneficial and of value, but it's also held within this deeper pattern. And I just felt that I didn't really want to be within that deeper pattern anymore. I wanted to be somewhere else, but I had to find it within myself, which sounds so cliche. It's terrible, but it's something that is almost like a I don't know, it's almost like I just had to wipe all the programs that had been running in me, or that I had I'd ingested, and just think, okay, let's just not look outside anymore. Let's just turn inward and see what might be there. And I actually was able to use the doorstep experiences that I have, just be able to go out and just notice what I was noticing, and notice it without trying to make any meaning or judgment to it. Literally just follow what I was attracted to. So, from a seasonal perspective, this time of year now, I know that the egret will come back at a certain point in time, and I'll be drawn to the egret because of the way that it contrasts in the sky, the grey and the white, and it doesn't stay very long. I think it's obviously making its journey somewhere, but there's a really deep sort of soulful connection that I have with the appearance of this bird. I don't know what it is, but I've gone past needing to know. Just being able to witness the arrival of the bird and then knowing that it will go is enough. And then there's wonderful lapwings, which sound like dolphins. I don't know if you ever heard them. They're beautiful birds. And again, they will arrive, and then I have the pleasure to be able to go out, and the privilege to be able to hear them and see them in terms of what they are doing and the cycles that they're involved in. And somehow in all of that mix, I was able to access, I suppose, what I call my own creative process, to really understand what is my creative process. How do I make meaning of my experience? And then how can I maybe start to create that in some way? So it's not to manipulate it. It's actually to be in relationship with what you mentioned there, all those different parts of myself, and use and call upon them in order to be able to have that fullness of experience in that particular moment of walking down the road and seeing the egret or the lapwings or the hares. Maybe I'm very lucky, actually. There's loads of hares around last summer, so I'm going off on one now, aren't I?
Literally the childhood curiosity. You're literally in the senses and observing. You don't have to understand.
No, you don't need to understand. And I think, there's such, we are, from a Western perspective, we are so biased towards rational logic understanding that we forget that we have all these other facets to us as very sensory creatures, and we can draw upon those gifts in order to have a real fullness and richness and connection to a sense of place that has value and meaning to our story, and that could be an individual story, but also the collective story. But it starts off initially with your making the sense of your own story.
It has to, doesn't it? It really does.
And then from there, I think it ripples out into other domains, in terms of if you wanted to share it with other people. But even if even with sharing, Penelope, for me, it's moving away from that prescriptive, this is how you do it, and this is the experience that you should be having. And if you're not doing it in that way, then you're not doing it in the way that you should be doing it. So there's a real sort of the invitation for me at the moment is around having the conversations to give people firstly the opportunity to consider that they are a creative being. Whatever that means to them. And then and then moving on from that, it's then, okay, so you're comfortable with the idea that you are a creative living being. Then what is your creative process? How can you really come into contact with that creative process? And then when you're in contact with that creative process, how does that then open up for you to really sense into the fact that we're all creative processes? The whole planet, the universe is a creative process. It's a living, breathing, creative process. And we all have that pattern within us. And partly it's actually how we start to be in relationship to that pattern and that depth that we have access to. But through the veneer of our modern life, we maybe have let it, fall away.
And tell us about, I think, in terms of your own finding your own process or the experience with the elm. And circling back to the elm. Was it the elm tree?
It is the elm tree. Yeah. So it's a funny thing. I mean, I've lived here for 18 years. And I've always known that the house was called Elm Cottage, and I thought, okay, there must be some elms here once upon a time, but there aren't any. And then we had some new neighbours who came in, and they did some work in their garden, and then he was starting to chop some trees down. And then I just said, and I said, no, stop. I think they're elm trees. And he said, no, they're not elm trees. We don't have elm trees. I said, no, I really do. I really do think they're elm trees. I think we just stop for a second. And he did stop. And we did discover that they were elm trees, which was just really quite special. And I found that, so initially in terms of my own creative practice, I'm quite a visual person. So I used to take lots of photos. I used to go out in nature and I used to see something that used to capture my attention, and I'd feel drawn to it, and then I'd want to create an image of that in some way. And at that moment in time, I didn't feel that I was a particularly artistic person, but I could take photographs, and I could take quite good photographs, and then I could arrange things and take photographs of what I'd arranged in nature as well, and I'd get a degree of achievement from that, and I think, oh, that's quite nice. But it also be able to look back at those photos and see something that wasn't there previously, to continue considering what was that piece, or what was that moment in nature inviting me to consider. So yeah, I used to take lots of photos, and then I decided that I wanted to try and have a go at doing some watercolor paintings. And I began with painting the elm trees, because I actually set up a studio in my greenhouse, so I thought, oh no, I can't make a mess in the house, but I can make a mess in the greenhouse. And the elm trees, they tap on the greenhouse in the wind, so there's sort of this movement and this noise. And I thought, okay, right, I'll do you in watercolors. And I just got so frustrated with myself, because I was trying to make an accurate representation. So from a figural point of view, I wanted them to look like elm trees, and I wanted them to be a perfect picture, so people will go, oh wow, they're elm trees. And I just didn't have the technical expertise, because I've never been to art school and I'm not trained. So it just wasn't working for me. And what was really interesting about that was, within that process, I was really sort of tapping into my own inner critic, as it were. The sort of the negativity, all this negativity was just sort of coming through me. But in a way, it was very useful, because I got to that point. I think within a creative process, you get to that point where you're so frustrated, you just have to have this explosion of energy. And I did, and I just went, right, paint everywhere. And I started using my hands, and I got some old I got some earth, and I got the elm tree leaves, and I started smearing it all around. And then I put water on there, and then I put more color on there, and then I put some ink on there. And at the end of it, I was like, I just felt so good. And I'd actually found that I liked what I'd created.
I love that. I love that.
I was like, wow,
yeah.
How did I do that? And but I didn't do it by thinking about it. I just did it by following my instinctive movement and what I felt wanted to happen next, through my hands and through the actual movement of what I was doing. And I wasn't worried about, I have to make a perfect representation. I just want to be able to capture somehow the essence or the energy of these trees as I experience them.
And it's such a wonderful example in terms of even like the process to find your creative process, because there's a lovely observer thing that you were doing with the photography and the arrangement, and then seeing the myth, the pattern, and what's sort of what was the nature trying to tell you towards, and then going into this really immersive process and feeling part of that, and all the different elements, and just the participant, being part of that. It's lovely.
It was a real, it was a real release.
Yes.
I tapped into something which I didn't even know I had access for, and I didn't have a language around it. And initially, that sort of, that was a bit concerning. I thought, and then I thought, well, that's okay, because that will come later. And I've always loved art, and I've always admired painters, in terms of how they can capture these wonderful expressions and images, and then the stories that go around that. But then what I also began to notice is the level of interpretation that people place on things. And actually, for me, it's the process itself which is important. It's not the actual end image. It's becoming aware of what you're seeing, feeling, noticing, hearing, as you engage in that process of trying to bring out an expression of what you feel towards, in my case, it's trees, nature related images and living beings, really.
Oh, yeah. And accessing, even you could go in beyond underneath that, what the trees and the living beings.
Yeah, you could go, oh, don't go down into the mycelium. We'd get lost down there.
And also you can't go back from that consciousness.
No, that's right. Yeah, it's a bit like Pandora's box, but it's a inverted Pandora's box, because rather than all the horrors of the world coming out, actually all the beauty of the world's come out. All of a sudden you suddenly realize that, wow, hang on, there is a form of expression which I and others can access in order to be able to bring forth new information, new perceptions, new ways of seeing, new ways of knowing, which can then be incorporated into that next creative process and cycle. So you sort of mentioned before, this whole notion of birthing and then dying and then birthing again, that is so inherent in the creative cycle, but also in the life cycle.
Yeah. And so you've had this, and you have got a language for it, beautiful language, and you're offering. So do you want to say?
Thank you. That's very kind of you. I mean, I'm quite self-conscious about it in many ways, because it's a different territory. So when I worked within organizations and as an organizational development practitioner and leadership and things, I used to call upon other people's language in order to give me a sense of legitimacy. And now I feel that I'm in a very vulnerable place, because I'm no longer calling on the work and theories of other people. I'm actually presenting and offering my own experience and putting a language around that. And obviously that I'm drawing from a very deep well of theoretical knowledge and experience, but I'm sort of synthesizing it in a way which feels congruent to how I access it, and how I would like to share it with other people.
Yeah,
so
isn't it?
it is, and you know what? I hold everything. I used to be quite precious about things, especially I think when you grow up with lots of theories and models and things, and you become very attached to those maps, when actually that's all that they are. They're not reality. They're just a way of orientating yourself within a framework, and then from that place, you can then make whatever meaning you want from it. So I hold quite lightly, and I'm quite so I'm not pressure. People say, oh well, that's just like that, or that's just like that. I go, well, that's fine, that's great, but I'm much more able to say, this is how I see it, and this is the way I choose to present it. If you choose to do it differently, then that's absolutely fine. And where in my past personas, then I would have been much quicker to have capitulated and said, oh, okay,
yeah.
So
yeah, I see your point. I'll adjust it.
yeah, exactly. Oh, I must have got it wrong. Yeah, must have been me. I'll do that. I'll change it.
So what have you?
So yeah. So I've got this. I have a it's a nature connected practice which I call earth journaling, and it's a bit of a mashup between art journaling, and going out into nature and having an experience and awareness of how you feel. So it's nothing more complicated than literally going out for a walk, but you're going out for a walk with an intention. So, and the invitation is always to begin with entering into a dialogue with whatever captures your attention, what you feel drawn to, what the heart is pulled towards. So for me, you probably picked up on it. I love birds, so I'm often drawn towards, the cry of a buzzard. I'll hear it, I'll look up, and then I'll follow the buzzard for a bit if I can, in terms of where it's going, or like with the egret and the lapwings. But for other people, it might be something completely different. It could be a tree, it could be a flower, it could be a branch, it could be the flow of water, it could be a puddle, a leaf. It can literally be anything. It's just starting to notice how this almost like a call and response gesture that you can start to engage in, and then you just hold that really lightly and become I use the word inquiry, but it's just being curious, really. That's all you're doing. You just actually think, well, that's interesting, so I wonder why I noticed that, and where's that taking me, and then what's there when I get there, and then how do those two things connect to each other, and then how does that maybe connect to me in this moment, and then how maybe does that connect to my wider story that I tell myself about myself. So you can sort of you can go around in sort of these little spirals. But to begin with, my suggestion for people is just to go out with an open heart and just notice what catches your attention and what you think, oh wow, I've never seen that before, and go and pay attention to whatever you've noticed. And I say enter into a relationship with it, so if people think, well, that's a bit weird, what do you mean by that? And all I mean by that is just become pay it some attention. So just notice the color of if it's a leaf, for example, or a tree, you're noticing its size, you're noticing its position in relation to other trees or shrubs, you're noticing the texture, the bark, any sort of mosses or fungi that might be growing around there. You're just really doing what you would do if you were in a bar and you saw someone that you quite liked and you thought, well, I want to spend a bit of time with that person, I'm just going to go and have a closer look.
Yeah, noticing. Yeah.
And then what you can do with it, you can, I invite people to take a photo if they want to. They don't have to take a photo. What you can do is you can make some image in that location just by gathering some various materials that you might find, and just see what wants to appear. And then the opportunity for you, that if you want to continue in that way, is that then you can record what your experiences in a little book of some kind, and you can start to make some sort of images and sketches. And then if you're really feeling adventurous, you can start to play with paints, and you can start to feel the texture of the paint, and you can start to find ways to make an expression of what you're seeing and noticing, and then your connection to that and your relationship to that. So it's a very personal practice, but it's a practice that you can you can do it solo, which is great. You don't need any special equipment. Probably a sturdy pair of walking boots. If you're in the UK, a good waterproof coat. And most people have an iPhone these days, and some common sense. I always think use your common sense. Think about where you're going, how long you're going to be out. Make sure your safety is paramount. And then, then you've got the opportunity, if you wanted to expand it with a group of people, and then you can start to have a conversation and a dialogue around, what did you notice, and what information did that offer to you? And people can then be able to share that. And I think the sharing bit is the really intriguing aspect for me, because we so quickly want to get into interpretation. Oh, well, that must mean this, or that must mean that. And the beauty is to try and just suspend the interpretation and just listen to what the other individual has to say and has to share. And just, again, it's bringing that information out so it has a presence, but you don't have to do anything with it.
Beautiful process. Beautiful.
So that's and it is, I mean, I draw very heavily from nature connected practices, and there is the link there with health and well-being, and then I'm just bringing in my own love of art, in a sense, but art in its broadest categorization.
Well, but it's also the source. I mean, every artist, there's the source of nature, isn't it? I mean, and I like that you use the self-expressive nature. It's really invitation, isn't it, to bring out your nature in the presence of wider nature, as a mirror, as a to reflect what you're noticing or engage with, and this sort of cultivation of an intuition. You're really inviting that.
You are, and I mean, from the bigger perspective in there is to, from a soulful connection, it's inviting people who are maybe a part of that generation that's always seen themselves as separate and seeing nature as out there. And I think we spoke about it in terms of, you're going to the park, or you're going to have an experience in nature. So it's inviting a different way to really frame what your intention is for being with nature. And partly it's just being with nature to acknowledge nature as a living entity within itself, that is there, that and we are part of that nature. And how to start to configure your internal frame from that point of view, rather than that separation, that otherness that is so, well, for most of us it's very deeply ingrained, but that's just partly the sort of the culture and the society that we all live in.
It is the human story, isn't it? It's the what is it? The wound that begets all wound, separation. So you went along this while you were still in the company and the organization, or?
No, at that point I had become self-employed, but I was working in an interim capacity.
Okay.
And I was thinking about how to combine both, because that was my ultimate aim. And it for a number of reasons, the synthesis just did not materialize at this point. It might come later, but so I thought, well, no, what I'll do is I'm going to spend time then really seeing if I can develop this practice as a practice, and then take it back into organizations at a later date if need be.
I love that, because I think you do need to disconnect and find your own truth in that, and the offering, and then bring it back in. Wonderful, Emma. Honestly, it gives me goosebumps to think about.
Oh, you're so kind.
Really, it does. I literally do, because this is a beautiful offering, helping people, because it's a really innate human. At some levels, it's sort of like, we can think about it being sort of woo woo, or a bit far-fetched, but
it's really trying to ground it in the practical. It's grounding it in the practical, in the everyday. It's accessible for people,
so accessible, and everybody does it at some level, and it's sort of like reminding people that's what they do. And if it was just, and if to bring that more in a conscious, the deepening of that.
And it would just be a wonderful thing to be able to bring and offer. It might happen, it might not, but there is such a benefit of being able to invite this experience into an organizational context, because it gives people access to so much more of themselves than they, there's that old cliche, isn't there, that people go into work and they just take their heads and then they leave their bodies behind, and so that they're just not bringing all themselves in. And how can you sort of start to invite people to bring more of themselves into the environment, so that they can start to really move into these really complex issues and dilemmas that we're facing now, because organizations will have a part to play in that new story or those new solutions that start to arise. But it's part of it is in this practice there is quite a, I said I was attracted initially to go down the psychotherapy route, and then I decided that wasn't for me. And that was partly because in that narrative there's something about having to keep going back over old ground in order to heal past hurts and heal past traumas. And yes, there is very much a place for that, and it's needed. But equally, there is a place now where we really need to become much more focused on what are we calling in, and what are we sort of putting out into that future space that we're stretching out into and moving into.
Yeah, that reimagined. And it sounds like it really invite, you're really wanting to get that embodied knowing of people and cultivate that, because we can't, as Tara Brach, I love her, she goes, we can't outthink it. These problems are so complex, and it is brilliant, but what is it? Thinking is not the ultimate of human potential.
Oh, that's lovely. Who said that? That's great. It?
Isn't that beautiful?
And that is so fabulous. Yeah.
So true. It's sort of like, this is like we have got superpowers. We. And and you're untapping that. And I love also this future orientated, like the present. What am I noticing now for that imagined future? Yeah.
And so it's just, thank you for giving me the opportunity to just share a little bit of that with you and some of my story. And I hope the people who are listening will find something of value in there, and maybe something which resonates with them, or maybe it'll open up a question that they may have for themselves, and which will lead to them going off and making discoveries for themselves, because that's what the whole purpose of really having these conversations is, isn't it? It's actually listening and thinking, well, gosh, yes, well, that's interesting, but I've had a similar experience, but my experience is very different from that. And actually then just seeing where that seeing where that may take you.
It is the sort of like the point of the podcast, is a stimulus of reflecting on your own story. But there is there's quite a, just probably who the audience is, that there's that being in that corporate world, feeling that stirring, and where do I have to detach in order to then get my and then come back into it, because we think we love organizations and people, so many of us that want to go back and help, help that new conversation. And
I was just going to say, I mean, someone who I look up to and has been very helpful for me in terms of really finding my place, corporate world, not corporate world, in the middle, where am I, is Margaret Wheatley.
Yes.
She writes and speaks so eloquently about that tension point, really, and where we can, I think she says something about where can you do your best work, and it's not, and it'll be different for everybody. So she recognizes that there's a real value of having transformational leaders within our institutions in order to be able to take them forward, but there's also a real value for having people outside of the organizations who are able to expand and broaden their perspective, because they're not confined by the constraints within that institution.
It is so true. It's like even when we're doing a mirroring of, like, in terms of a vision fast, actually one person mirroring is one thing, but you want everybody to mirror back that story being heard, because everybody has their own perspective, and it's the richness, which goes back to your bringing in and diverse voices anyway, and deeply listening to each other.
It is, and I think, I mean, in an ideal, I don't know, I suppose where I've got to now is, or the question I sit with is, how do we bring an ecological perspective into organizations, or how do we even bring an ecological perspective more into the mainstream? So it goes back into that human-centeredness. We need to expand out into, and regardless of what your religion is, what your spirituality is, yes, it has those dimensions, because we're going beyond ourselves, because we're looking beyond the humanness, as it were. We're not devaluing the humanness. The human is still intrinsic and valuable and vital, but there is another dimension here that needs to come into the conversation, and it needs to be slap bang in the heart of the conversation, and guide and then direct and influence those choices and decisions and actions that we're wanting to take. And I don't have an answer, and I'm sure there are people who do have answers, but there's a real, I just really feel it at the moment, in terms of, and particularly in terms of, what next? Where might I go? What might I do? And part of accessing our creative process, I think, is maybe as a way to help people begin to engage with this idea of this ecological perspective, because the ecological, that's a creative process within itself, so it's just an easier connect, if that makes sense.
Yes, it so makes sense. And I love you stepping into that wider, bigger conversation on that. Wow, gifts to share, really.
Oh, you're so generous. You're such a wonderful, generous human being there, with your podcast and having these conversations, and listening to people like me who are got strange stories to tell.
Lovely. I mean, if you're a listener, why do you listen to the podcast?
Well, I love the eclectic mix of experiences that you have, and also the people that come on to your podcast, that it almost is an invitation for other people to step into their true selves, and realize that it is a little bit scary, and it does feel a little bit strange, and it might be uncomfortable, but actually that it's when you start to understand that you are actually in a process, and you're actually moving somewhere, even if you don't know where you're going. It's absolutely fine.
In fact, is that the only job we have to do as humans? Come back to your own self. But thank you for that. And I love that, because I think that everybody, I feel like I could interview everybody in the world will have a story about a nature connection.
Yeah.
And so and I'm pleased that you're one of them that's on here.
Thank you. And what's beautiful about it is, you're not saying that this is the way that you need to have that nature connection. It's infinite.
Yeah, infinite.
It is infinite, because people can connect with nature wherever they are, whatever their circumstances, and however they want to do it. They could be having a wonderful spider plant in their bathroom. Yeah, but they have a connection, and they have a love for that plant, and they care for that plant, and it brings them joy, and it brings them a sense of purpose in their life that they're leading at that moment. So, and that's a wonderful thing. And it's just bringing that awareness out to people of how much nature offers us without actually asking for anything in return.
Gratitude to that. Gratitude to you. I'm going to put a pause here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I'm going to do a thank you.
So we'll put a pause here and see you back for the next Earth Converse podcast. In the meantime, go out and enjoy Earth, one conversation at a time.